She's completely unhinged, my mother-in-law announced to the entire waiting room, loud enough for every person holding a paper coffee cup to look up. She dragged my son into this courtroom because she's jealous of what we built. She has nothing. She is nothing. I sat 2 benches away and said absolutely nothing. I didn't look at her. I didn't look at my ex-husband, who was staring at the floor in that particular way men do when they know they've already lost. I just opened my planner, uncapped my pen, and wrote down 3 things I needed to follow up on after the hearing. My attorney leaned over and whispered, "You ready?" I said, "I've been ready for 2 years. Let me back up. Because none of this makes sense without knowing who I was before that courtroom, and more importantly, who I was the morning my daughter asked me a question I will never forget for the rest of my life. Her name is Maisie. She was 4 years old. She had been standing at the living room window for 45 minutes in her party dress, the yellow one with the little white daisies she had picked out herself from the rack at Target. She had her hands pressed flat against the glass, fogging it with her breath. "Mommy," she said, without turning around. "Did Grandma forget?" I was standing in the kitchen doorway holding a cake I had made from scratch the night before. Lemon with cream cheese frosting. Maisie's favorite. There were 4 candles on it in the shape of the number 4. I had driven 40 minutes to a specialty baking store to find those candles because she had seen them in a video and asked for them specifically. I said, "They might just be running late, baby." She turned around and looked at me with those eyes she has, big and brown and so completely honest that they cut right through you, and she said, "You told me 10 o'clock. It was 12:17. I put the cake on the counter, walked to the window, and lifted her into my arms. She rested her chin on my shoulder and didn't say anything else. She had already figured it out. She was 4 years old, and she had already figured out what the adults in my life had spent 2 years trying to convince me I was wrong about. That was the day everything changed. I need to explain what my marriage looked like from the outside, because from the outside it looked like a lot of things it wasn't. My ex-husband, I'll call him my ex because that's what he is, came from a family that had money the way some families have furniture. It had always been there. Nobody talked about where it came from originally. There was a property management company his father had started, real estate across 3 counties, and a general understanding in the family that everything would eventually go to my ex and his brother. When we got married, I was 26. I had a master's degree in forensic accounting and had just accepted an offer with a firm that handled financial investigations for federal cases. Not glamorous. Very long hours. Very detail-oriented work. My mother-in-law called it essentially being an accountant at our rehearsal dinner, in a toast, while everyone laughed politely. I smiled. I was good at smiling then. The first few years were fine, or fine adjacent. We bought a house in a neighborhood my mother-in-law approved of. My ex worked loosely in the family business, attending meetings, signing things, golfing with his father on Thursdays. I worked 60-hour weeks and came home to a house that somehow always needed something from me specifically. Maisie was born when I was 28. I took 6 weeks of maternity leave. My mother-in-law told people at her church that I had abandoned my daughter by going back to work. My ex said she didn't mean it that way. He said that a lot. She doesn't mean it that way. The trouble officially started, the kind that leaves a paper trail, when my ex's brother came to us with an investment opportunity. His brother was married to a woman I'll call my sister-in-law, though the word sister implies a warmth that never existed between us. She was the kind of person who asked questions designed to make you feel small. "Oh, you're still at the same firm? Oh, Maisie's not in private school yet?" She smiled while she said these things. We all smiled. It was a very smiley family. The investment was a restaurant group. 3 locations, supposedly cash flowing, supposedly just needing a capital injection to expand to 2 more. My brother-in-law had gotten in early. He wanted us to join. The number he quoted was significant, the kind of number that is not a number you write a personal check for without doing serious due diligence. I did the due diligence. That's literally what I do for a living. What I found was not a restaurant group that was cash flowing. What I found was a restaurant group that had been cash flowing 18 months ago, before a series of decisions that had quietly hollowed it out. The books had been managed in a way that looked fine on a surface read but revealed, once you knew where to look, a pattern of delayed payables and inflated receivables that was textbook window dressing. I wrote up a 12-page memo. I sat down with my ex and walked him through every page. He listened. He nodded. He said, "You're so smart, you know that?" And then he told his parents I had called his brother a fraud. I had not called his brother a fraud. I had written a financial analysis memo. But the version that circulated at Thanksgiving that year at the table where I sat next to my husband while his mother served him an extra portion of everything was that I had accused the family of criminal activity because I was jealous of his brother's success. My ex did not correct this. He passed the gravy. We lasted another 8 months after that. The end was not dramatic. It was quiet in the way that endings are when one person has been leaving for a long time and the other person has been pretending not to notice. He told me he needed space. I told him I needed honesty. We disagreed about which of us was being unreasonable. I filed first. I had consulted an attorney 6 weeks before I said a word to him, because I had learned by then that preparation is not coldness, it's survival. The custody arrangement was where his family showed their hand completely. My mother-in-law hired her son's attorney. That's not a metaphor, she literally called the law firm, she was present at strategy meetings, and she funded the retainer. I know this because it came out in Discovery. She treated the custody case like a family business matter, which, in her mind, I suppose it was. I was a liability to be managed. Maisie was an asset to be retained. They put forward a parenting plan that would have given me every other weekend and Wednesday afternoons. The justification was my work schedule. The implication was that a woman who worked the way I worked was not a mother in any meaningful sense of the word. I worked the way I worked because I was very good at it. In the 2 years since the investment memo incident, I had been promoted twice. I was now a senior investigator on a team that consulted directly with 2 federal agencies whose names I'm not permitted to use in this context. I had testified as an expert witness in 4 cases. I had been quoted in a financial publication that my mother-in-law had almost certainly never read. None of that was in the parenting plan they submitted. The birthday party was in the middle of all of this. The custody case was ongoing. We had a temporary arrangement reasonable on paper that included the in-laws having regular time with Maisie. I had agreed to this, because I am not someone who uses a child as a weapon, and because Maisie loved her grandparents with the uncomplicated love that children have before adults teach them who they're supposed to love conditionally. Maisie's 4th birthday fell on a Saturday. The temporary arrangement allowed me to have her for the full day. Her grandparents, my ex's parents, had told her, in front of me, at a handoff 2 weeks earlier, that they would come to her party. They had said this while she was standing right there. They had let her hug them and say, "You're coming to my birthday," and they had said, "Of course we are, sweetheart." I had not planned the party around them. I planned it around Maisie. 8 of her nursery school friends, a backyard full of bubbles, a piñata shaped like a butterfly, and a lemon cake with number 4 candles. At 8:47 that Saturday morning, I received a text from my ex. It said, "Something came up. My parents can't make it today. Sorry." That was the entire message. I looked at that text for a long moment. Then I looked at the butterfly piñata hanging from the oak tree in the backyard. Then I looked at the yellow daisy dress on the hanger on Maisie's closet door, because she had insisted on hanging it up herself the night before, so it would be ready. I replied to my ex, "Okay, I'm not going to tell her until she asks." He did not respond. Maisie asked at 12:17. I cut the cake at 12:30 with 8 4-year-olds and my best friend, who had driven an hour to be there, and my neighbor, who brought her daughter and also a bottle of wine. She sat quietly on the kitchen counter, with a look that said everything. Maisie ate 2 pieces and got frosting on her collar and hugged every single one of her friends goodbye and pronounced the butterfly piñata, the best piñata in the whole world. She was 4. She moved through the heartbreak with a grace that I have tried to learn from since. That night, after she was asleep, I sat at my kitchen table, and I opened my laptop. I did not send an angry email. I did not call my ex. I did not post anything on social media. I pulled up the financial disclosure documents his family had submitted as part of the custody proceedings, the ones meant to establish that I was financially volatile, and they were financially stable, and I started reading in them the way I read documents for work. It took me 4 hours to find the first problem. Here is the thing about people who have always had money. They often develop a very confident sloppiness about paperwork. They sign things without reading them. They move figures between accounts with the breezy certainty of people who have never been audited. They hire accountants who are loyal rather than rigorous. They build structures that look solid until someone who actually knows what they're looking at pulls one thread. I was someone who knew what I was looking at. The property management company had been restructured twice in the past 4 years. On paper, this looked like ordinary business optimization. In practice, when you mapped the restructuring against the family's personal financial disclosures, there was a gap, not a small gap. A gap with a number attached to it that had a lot of zeros. Assets had moved. The question was where they had moved to, and why the timing aligned, almost perfectly, with the initiation of my divorce. I'm not a private attorney. I don't do civil litigation. But I know exactly which attorneys do, and I know exactly what kind of documentation they find useful, and I know how to prepare a memo that makes a forensic accountant's findings legible to a judge. I worked until 3 a.m. Then I called my attorney first thing Monday morning. I said, I need to add something to our filing. The next 6 months were the quietest I had been in years. I went to work. I came home to Maisie. I made dinner and gave baths and read the same picture book about a bear who couldn't sleep approximately 400 times. I did not discuss the case with anyone except my attorney. I did not give my ex or his family any indication of what was coming. My mother-in-law, in the absence of any reaction from me, apparently concluded that I had accepted my position. She became more comfortable. She made a comment through a mutual acquaintance about how I had always been better suited to an office than a home. She told her son that Maisie was adjusting well to spending time primarily with the family. She was correct that Maisie was adjusting well. Maisie adjusts well to everything because Maisie has a mother who works very hard to make sure she always has a safe landing. She was incorrect about everything else. The deposition was on a Thursday. My mother-in-law arrived in a cream-colored blazer. She brought her own attorney separate from her son's, which I noted, and she sat at the table with the particular posture of a woman who has never doubted her own authority in any room. I was present as a witness, not as an attorney. I sat across the table and answered questions about my finances, my work schedule, my parenting, my character. I answered everything directly. I did not elaborate beyond what was asked. I did not show any emotion. Her attorney at one point referenced my work, my actual work, the federal cases, the expert testimony, and described it in a summary that was inaccurate in 3 specific ways that mattered. I said politely, I'd like to clarify that characterization. Her attorney looked at me over his glasses and said, You'll have the opportunity to submit a written response. I said, Of course, and I wrote it down in my planner. At the end of the deposition, my mother-in-law leaned toward her attorney and said, in a voice that was perhaps meant to be quieter than it was, She's trying to intimidate us. This is a performance. I finished writing my note and capped my pen. The court date was set for March. By February, our team, my attorney, the forensic accountant she had brought in to review my findings, and a civil litigator who specialized in exactly this kind of asset concealment, had assembled a filing that ran to 63 pages plus exhibits. I am not going to explain every detail of what we found, because it is genuinely complicated and also because some of it is still subject to related proceedings. What I will tell you is that the gap I found at 3 a.m. on my kitchen table the night after Maisie's birthday was real. It was documented. It was significant enough that when our filing was submitted, it didn't just affect the custody case. It attracted the attention of a third party I had not anticipated. The same 2 federal agencies I had done consulting work for had an interest in the property management company that predated my divorce by about 7 months. They had been looking at it from a different angle. Our filing gave them a new one. I found out when my attorney called me on a Wednesday morning and said, in a voice I had not heard from her before, Okay, so, you need to know something. The court date arrived gray and cold, with that particular March sky that can't decide if it wants to rain. I wore a dark blazer. I had dropped Maisie at my neighbor's house, where she was going to spend the morning baking muffins. I had told her I had a work meeting. She had told me to bring her back a muffin, and I had said I would try. The courthouse had that specific institutional smell, floor wax and recycled air and something that might be old paper. I sat outside the courtroom with my attorney and went over nothing, because there was nothing left to go over. We had prepared, we had documented. We were ready. My ex and his family arrived together. My mother-in-law had upgraded to a different blazer navy this time. She walked past me without looking at me. Her attorney, the family attorney, not the deposition one, nodded at my attorney, with the professional courtesy of opposing counsel who know each other's work. My ex looked tired. He looked like a man who had understood, somewhere in the past few weeks, that things had moved considerably beyond his control. He was right. The judge was a woman in her 60s with the efficient manner of someone who has heard every version of every story and will not be performing interest she doesn't feel. The initial portion of the hearing was procedural. Filings were referenced. The custody arrangement was outlined. I answered questions when addressed. My ex answered questions when addressed. It was orderly and quiet. Then the judge set down the papers she was holding and looked at the opposing table and said, "I want to address the financial disclosures." There was a shift in the room. Small, but present. The judge said, specifically, "I want to address the amended disclosures your client submitted in January in response to the petitioner's supplemental filing." The family's attorney said, "We believe the amended disclosures accurately represent." The judge said, "I've reviewed both the original disclosures and the supplemental filing." She paused. "I've also received a communication this week from an outside party regarding an overlapping matter that touches on the assets described in these documents." The family's attorney stopped speaking. The judge looked at my mother-in-law, directly at her, not at her attorney, and said, "I want to understand who prepared the original financial disclosures for your family." My mother-in-law looked at her attorney. Her attorney looked at the judge and said, "The disclosures were prepared by the family's accountant, Your Honor." The judge said, "And has that accountant reviewed the supplemental analysis submitted by the petitioner?" There was a pause that lasted approximately 5 seconds. In a quiet courtroom, 5 seconds is a very long time. The attorney said, "We've reviewed the petitioner's filing, yes." The judge said, "And the discrepancies identified in that filing?" Another pause. I watched my mother-in-law's hand, which was resting on the table, press down until her knuckles were flat. The judge said, "I'm going to be direct. The petitioner in this case is a federally credentialed forensic accountant with expert witness experience in financial proceedings. The analysis she submitted is, I'll be frank, more rigorous than the work product I typically see at this level of family court." She paused again. "I'd like to know whether counsel was aware of the petitioner's professional background when the original parenting plan was submitted." The room was very quiet. My mother-in-law turned and looked at her attorney with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was not anger. It was the specific look of someone realizing, all at once, that the ground beneath them is not what they thought it was. Her attorney said, carefully, "We were aware that the petitioner worked in accounting, Your Honor." The judge said, "In accounting." She looked down at the file in front of her. "She has testified as an expert witness before the end." She named one of the two agencies. The name hung in the courtroom like weather. "And the parenting plan your firm submitted described her work schedule as evidence of limited availability for primary custody." Silence. My attorney did not move. I did not move. I had spent 6 months practicing not moving. The judge looked at our table and said, "I have some additional questions for the petitioner's counsel, but first, does opposing counsel have anything to add?" The family's attorney said, "Your Honor, we would request a brief recess." The judge said, "Denied." What followed was procedural in the way that consequential things often are, a series of statements and clarifications and references to documents, building quietly toward a conclusion that had been inevitable since I sat down at my kitchen table at 11 p.m. with a cup of cold coffee and started reading. The custody arrangement that was finalized gave me primary physical custody. Generous and structured visitation was outlined for my ex. The financial matters, the discrepancies in the family's disclosures, were referred for separate proceedings. The outside party who had communicated with the court would be coordinating through their own channels. My ex signed what he was given to sign. He didn't look at me when it was over, but as we were both standing in the hallway, putting on our coats, he said quietly, "I didn't know it was going to go this far." I said, "Which part?" He didn't answer. I finished buttoning my coat and picked up my bag. He said, "She's really good at her, you know." "At Maisie." I said, "I know. I'm her mother." I walked down the hall, and out through the heavy doors into the gray March air, and I called my neighbor, and I said, I'm coming to pick her up. Is there a muffin left? I picked up Maisie from my neighbor's house at 11:45. She had saved me a blueberry muffin, wrapped in a paper towel, which she handed to me with great ceremony the moment I came through the door. She said, "How was your work meeting?" I said, "Really good, actually." She said, "Did you win?" I stopped and looked at her. She was 4.5 now. Almost 5. She was wearing her yellow daisy dress. She had asked to wear it again that morning, for no reason she could explain, just because she wanted to, and she had a small smear of blueberry on her chin. I crouched down to her level and I said, "Yeah, we won." She said, "Good," with the complete satisfaction of a person for whom this was never really in doubt. I held her hand the whole way home. My mother-in-law's attorney filed a motion for reconsideration. It was denied. The related financial proceedings moved forward on their own timeline, through their own mechanisms, in rooms I was not present for. I submitted documentation when requested and otherwise returned to my work, my house, and my daughter. 6 months after the hearing, I received a message from a blocked number that I'm fairly certain was my ex-sister-in-law. It said, "You destroyed this family." I thought about that for a moment. Then I thought about a 4-year-old in a yellow dress with her hands pressed flat against a window, fogging it with her breath. I didn't reply. Some things speak for themselves. Other things, you have to document. After 9 years of being in that family, I had learned the difference. Maisie turned 5 in July. We had a party in the backyard. Bubbles, a piñata, a star this time, because she had moved on from butterflies, and a lemon cake with a number 5 candle. Every single person I invited showed up. Some of them were early. She stood at the door and watched people arrive with an expression of pure, uncomplicated happiness, and at one point she turned to me and said, "Mommy, everyone came." I said, "Yeah, baby, everyone came." She grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the backyard, toward the bubbles and the noise and all the people who had shown up, and I let her pull me, because that's what you do when the person you love most in the world is running toward something good. You run with them.